Welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Marshall McDaniel and Hillary Olson. Soil health principles can help guide farmers in best practices for long-term soil health and improvement. However, it's important to test these principles across locations and contexts to see how their implementation is actually shaping soil health. In this episode, Marshall and Hillary join me to discuss testing the soil health principles in Iowa and how this might be expanded into further regions. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Marshall McDaniel and Hillary Olson with us. Marshall is an associate professor in soil-plant interactions in the agronomy department at Iowa State University. His research group focuses on carbon and nutrient exchange between plants and soils and how management and the environment affect this exchange. He uses soil health as a framework for moving toward a more profitable, regenerative, and sustainable agriculture. Hillary was raised on a family row crop and farrow-to-finish hog farm in central Iowa. She received a bachelor's in animal science and a master's in soil science at Iowa State University. She's worked for NRCS as a soil conservationist in multiple field offices across Iowa. She and her husband farm in central Iowa and have a row crop operation and had a cow-calf herd for 20 years. She's been in the state soil health specialist role for Iowa NRCS since 2020. Welcome to the show. How are you both doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
Yes, for sure.
Wonderful. We are so thrilled to have you. So today we are talking about the Natural Resource Conservation Service's soil health principles and kind of putting them to the test in the field and just kind of testing to make sure that they are doing what we think they are. So to get us started, can you just give us an overview of I don't know if it's NRCS ships or if you call them SHPs, however that is. Give us an overview of kind of what they are, how they came about, some of the history, and kind of why they need more testing.
So the soil health principles, they include minimizing disturbance, maximizing the cover, maximizing living roots, and maximizing biodiversity. In Iowa, we also have integrating livestock included as the fifth principle. You will see different variations of soil health principles depending on which group you're talking to. So some groups in industry have added a sixth principle recently, and that is context. So that includes your inherent soil properties, how that soil was formed, if it's a sandier soil versus like where I am in central Iowa. We have mollisols that are very productive, formed under prairie vegetation. And so I like to say our soils are kind of like the Olympic athletes of soil. And so you need to think in terms of what the farmer might be dealing with in those terms, in addition to what they have for maybe their equipment, what their labor constraints might be. And so all of those things really need to play a key role in your recommendations that you're working with this farmer who wants to incorporate some of these practices like reducing tillage or adding cover crops, maybe extending their crop rotation. And so these principles are just sort of guiding ideas or things that we need to be considering when we're working with farmers. What it might look like on each individual farm is going to be unique. You could even have neighboring farms that will have unique takes on which practices they're incorporating. So to give you a little background, so I was curious. I've been curious about this since I started this role 5 years ago. And in doing research on how these were developed, that story is a little nebulous. So there was multiple people, agencies, even different, across the country, in the United States, across other countries, So there's multiple people involved, and it really initiated with this soil quality effort is what it was first. The effort was first coined, and that developed into this what we refer to now as soil health. And so I think that the soil health term resonated with people maybe more than the soil quality term did. And so we saw those emerging around 2006 to 2010. It depended on, for NRCS, the state you were in. So in Iowa, we saw mention of the soil health principles starting around 2010, 2011. And so it just depended on what state you're in as far as when those were embraced. Nationally, the NRCS started a soil health division, and that was around 2015. And so that's when the effort really took off, at least within NRCS. A lot more emphasis on how these principles, how these management practices can impact our soil, make them more resilient, and how they impact the soil functions.
Sure. Marshall, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here with my friend and colleague, Hillary. I mean, that's a great history. And that's one of the reasons why I turned to her early to kind of ask some of those questions, like where did these principles start? And, what's the origin? And Hillary, correct me if I'm wrong too, but they're all kind of based in the idea that nature knows best, right? The soils. I loved your analogy too of the Olympic athletes. I'm also in central Iowa in Ames, where Iowa State University is. And yes, we have very fertile soils. We have international students that come out here and are amazed how dark they are. We get a lot of productivity out of them. And we know there's some issues with management. We've got some environmental issues. And that's where a lot of these principles come from. But they come from the idea that, the prairies and oak savanna prairies that developed these soils, they had cover. They didn't have frequent tillage and disturbance. There were some other disturbances, maybe fire and other kind of less frequent natural disturbances, but they developed under those conditions. And that's what these soil health principles are kind of trying to get at is, farming closer to the conditions that the soils were formed under.
I'm glad you brought that up. The livestock integration principle, that was, when the herds of bison were going across the plains, they had a lot of short-term significant disturbance as they grazed. They moved on, and so those soils and the grasses and the forbs had a long time to recover, and so that really impacted how our soils were formed, and that the carbon deposition into our soils and increasing the soil organic matter. So that plays a huge role. I can't remember if I brought this up earlier, but so nationally, I think around 2018, NRCS merged animal integration with the maximizing biodiversity. Now here locally in Iowa, we chose to leave those separate.
Sure. Yeah. Is that just because there's more livestock, or because there's fewer livestock, so they're like that's a separate animal, for lack of a better term, to like incorporate?
That's a good question. I wasn't involved with those conversations nationally at that time, leading into that decision to merge those two principles. But in Iowa, we just felt that by leaving it separate, we can maybe, I don't know, place more emphasis on it when we're doing our outreach. Also in Iowa, a lot of our fences have been removed around our fields, and so it can be a challenging one to accomplish for a row crop farmer. But if you are able to achieve that, I like to say it's like the icing on the cake if you can do that, because those animals will process the residue. What comes out the back end of the cow is readily available food for our soil microbes, and so they can really exacerbate the impact of the change much more quickly, but it's not always achievable. And I understand that, and that just goes back to your context.
Sure. Yeah, totally makes sense. I think I already sort of understand the answer that I might receive for this question, but it's interesting to be like, oh, soil health is a thing starting in 2010 because obviously people have understood to a certain degree that soil health matters, and you know, we learned in the Dust Bowl you can't just not take care of it in any way. So, but I'm curious, like, was this just kind of codifying things and giving language to things that were kind of more innately understood, or kind of just, yeah, we care about this, but we don't have research to back up how to take care of this? Or was it like something with, for example, you know, genotyping, where it was like we didn't have the technology to like figure out all those tiny things until a recent period. So now there's a new technology that has like really advanced it in a way that has allowed us to give language to it. If that question makes sense.
Yeah, I think in my mind, prior to this effort, we looked at these different practices individually. So I remember in the field offices having a lot of conversations about, okay, you have steep soils to stay in compliance with your USDA benefits. You have to reduce your tillage. You have to no-till. And then I think it was about 2012, cover crops really came on the scene in Iowa. And so then we started to understand that you could really improve your soil when you could adopt multiple practices. And when you viewed it in those terms, it made a lot more sense. And so trying to look at the whole system and how these things interacted. And I also think maybe, and Marshall, correct me if I'm wrong, but the soil microbiome, I don't think we knew a whole lot about it prior to those years, maybe. And so I think that really played a key role in driving this, because now we understand that the root exudates and the carbon is really feeding those soil microbes, and how that impacts our soil functions.
I think one thing I would add, Hillary, is that, and I actually, when I talk to farmers and students about this, I often show this graph of, I don't know if you both are familiar with Google Ngram. Hillary's probably seen me present this before. So if you put in the term soil tilth, soil quality, soil health in Google Ngram, it shows these trends over time. So what Google has done is they've scanned all of human text, English in this case, but you can now find other languages, and it shows the percentage of those terms used over time. So my grandfather would have used the term soil tilth, but we don't talk about that very much anymore. And that was the focus mostly on the physical aspect and the ability of the soil to act as a seed bed. Then in I'd say probably the 70s and 80s, you know, when I was a kid, the soil quality term was used more and more, and that still included tilth, but more focused on, and at that time there was a lot of university extension programs on soil fertility and chemistry, better living through chemistry, right? And at kind of the tail end of that. And that was in the 80s. And then in the 90s and into the 2000s, as Hillary said, you know, we just improved our understanding of soils and the microorganisms that are in it. The technology changed in how we study them in the soil, DNA extractions, and we started to look at soil as a living entity and focusing on the biology. So there's this kind of transition from tilth to quality that you can definitely see in human literature and English literature over the years. It's kind of interesting to look at.
I love that. Huge fan of just kind of that long history building on itself as we continue to progress the science and knowledge base. So it feels like it's kind of a bit of a shift both as we've unlocked new knowledge about the microbiome, as well as maybe taking a more holistic approach in certain ways. So that's wonderful. But now we are kind of moving into this new phase of kind of testing it, making sure that we have robust information on what is making the biggest impacts, it seems like. So I would love to hear more about just kind of your thoughts on what we need to test and why, as well as how you went about it.
Yeah, so the initial idea for this study the Soil Health Principle campaign is probably my favorite of the NRCS campaigns, and I think very successful. You can tell by, as we allude to in the paper, and Hillary has mentioned that, not just NRCS, but other folks, university, even industry and NGOs have picked it up and, added to or subtracted from the number of principles. And as far as the science goes, there has been a lot of research under individual practices, right? So the practice of no-till, for example, is one of the most studied. And there are actually meta-analyses. That's another buzzword or jargon. Meta-analysis is just a study of studies. So there are actually several no-till meta-analyses where people have compiled all the research about no-till effects on soil biology, on soil carbon. And we find mostly positive benefits. And that's just one practice, right? And it covers maybe one or two of the soil health principles. Very few, to our knowledge, maybe none, have come up with a kind of novel index that ranks practices from as low as 0, at least one of, should be above 0, up to 5 on the adoption of the NRCS Soil Health Principles score. So we looked at that as an opportunity to kind of use these range of long-term experiments that are mostly in central Iowa, a few outside central Iowa realm. And most of them are in central Iowa because we're in Ames. It's convenient for researchers to get to these long-term experiments here. But there's a wide variety of practices that we can kind of put on the scale from 0 to 5 on a soil health principle scale.
Sure. And the two sub questions off of this. First, when you say long term, I'm curious how long term is long term in this context. And then are these something where you're just visiting like someone else is doing an experiment on XYZ and you just are like, hey, I'm just gonna sample your soil real quick, and then rather than you like having a long-term experiment that is specifically testing these principles?
Yeah, great questions. So to answer your first question about long-term, so some of them are longer than others. And actually a colleague of mine, Professor Emeritus, retired faculty Matt Liebman, started up an experiment called the Marsden Agriculture Diversification Experiment. He didn't even think that it was going to be a long-term experiment. He was planning on a grant cycle of 3 to 5 years. He's a weed scientist, weed ecologist, but that experiment kept going, and it's one of our oldest ones. I think that one is at the 20-year mark. Oh no, we had his was 16 years. There's another experiment established and started by Cindy Cambardella, used to be working at the Soil Tilth Lab, now the National Laboratory of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences, or the NLAE. So that's the longest, but one of the shortest or youngest long-term experiments was only 3 years, and it includes a perennial crop miscanthus and a study that we call perennial ground cover. It's a little bit different than annual cover crops like cereal rye, but we grow grasses in between the corn and soybean rows. So that gives you an idea of a little bit about some of the different management, but also the longevity of some of these experiments. And they weren't all started at the same time. That, to keep that as a controlled variable would have been nice, but that is very rare. It would be a very unusual circumstance to start this many experiments. I think we had 9 long-term experiments that we sampled from colleagues. And this gets at your second question, Abby. So you asked, did we just go out and sample? No. One, we wanted a few years. So 3 was our minimum. So being at least 3 years old and having a practice, at least one practice. Some of the long-term experiments actually have 2 practices that cover soil health principles. And when they include both of those together, that's called a factorial, or also we might expect synergy, right? So that practice would get a higher score on the soil health principle score. And one example of an experiment where we did there was my colleague, Matt Helmers. He has an experiment where they are doing chisel plow, tillage, no tillage, and then no cereal rye winter cover crop, and then cereal rye winter cover crop, and then the combination of no-till and the cereal rye. So that's that's called a factorial experiment, where it's 2 by 2. You have with and without tillage, with and without cover crop. So that was a nice one that kind of spans a range of the soil health principles too, just based on having those 2 practices being either absent or present. And so, again, the reason that I kind of connected all these long-term experiments is because I was a early career faculty at the time. I made friends fast, friends that had established experiments already. Luckily, had the great privilege of working with these experienced researchers, ranging from being in ag engineering departments to horticulture to agronomy, and still working with many of them. A few of them are retired now, but I've had a great experience working with these folks, and some of these experiments are still going on right now.
Marshall, I actually think that's a strength that your studies weren't adopted at the same time, because I often get questions from farmers. Okay, if I start these practices, when am I going to start to see the impacts? And so I think that gives you the gamut there. Okay, so we've started. When can we start to see how this impacts the measurements that you selected, and what does that look like? So I thought that was a positive.
Great point. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it, Hillary.
Yeah, for sure. So you were taking these experiments and kind of ranking them on how they were incorporating these principles, and then you were tying that then to like soil health measurements, I believe. And you had 3 that are kind of slow movers on changing, and then you had some that were a little faster. So I would love to know more about kind of what measurements you were looking for and why you chose those ones.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I like how you called them slow movers. They're, and actually I've changed my view on these a little bit. I look at some of the more physical and chemical to be slow movers, or let's call it the tortoise, versus, microbial biomass and things more biological related. And some biochemical indicators to be the hare that change a little bit faster. There have been papers, and this isn't a new idea. There's papers going back to the 80s proposing that kind of particularly microbes are kind of a canary in the coal mine. Sorry to mix all these animal metaphors here. Canary in the coal mine, but early change indicator when changing a management practice. So we'd expect them to be more responsive to the soil health principles as well. And indeed, we found that. Some of the slower ones that you mentioned, though. Oh, and one other criteria that we tried to, not all of them fit this, but we tried to do measurements that growers could get at a commercial lab, except for one of them in particular, microbial biomass. And I kind of had a selfish reason for that, because I'd like to see more labs adopt microbial biomass as a measurement. But these are measurements that are available at commercial labs, like total organic carbon or soil organic matter, and that's one of the slower changing ones. Bulk density and maximum water holding capacity. These are both slow changing. The water holding capacity, we actually published a paper, and are we able to link to papers on this too?
Yep, totally. We'll
So
add it
yeah,
to the show notes.
great. Yeah, I will. I'll attach a link to that paper. But we do this with just a funnel and filter paper, and we even tested it against using coffee filters. So you can do it with kitchen utensils, a funnel, filter paper, and an inexpensive balance. So we were trying to do these measurements that are more accessible and expensive, either that growers, conservationists, agronomists can do on their own or get at a commercial lab. The water holding capacity, even though it's easy to do, it wasn't very responsive, we found in our study. Bulk density, that's something that someone could do very easily in their own field, even using a coffee can, just excavating out soil and measuring the mass, the dry mass per unit volume, gives you an idea of the structure and the pore space, which is a very important metric of soil health. And that one we did find change with our soil health principle score. And as you'd expect, the more soil health principles that are adopted, the lower the bulk density is, meaning there's less mass per unit volume, greater pore space. We weren't surprised that soil organic matter, total soil organic carbon, we showed no change. So that did confirm a slow to change. So maybe if we were to have resampled these again in 20, 30 years, we might see more of a linear positive response with the soil health principles, but it was pretty unresponsive in our first go at it.
Sure. And then what were kind of your canaries that you were testing, and how responsive were they?
Thanks for bringing back the animal metaphors again. Yes. So some of we picked 3 kind of early indicators, the ones we expected to be more responsive to the soil health principle scores. We picked soil microbial biomass. This is one of our standard measurements we do in a lot of our studies in my research group. And the way we measure this is we use chloroform, which is most people are familiar with this as the knockout gas in the movies. You know, they put it on the rag and knock somebody out and throw them in the back of their trunk. So you can actually use this chloroform to lyse microbe cells in the soil, basically explode or dissolve the microbe cells, and then all their guts enter the soil. You do an extraction on the chloroform soil, you extract the non-chloroformed, and the difference in the carbon in those 2 samples, one has all the microbe guts in it, one has the microbes intact. That gives us an estimate for how much of their biomass is. Another measurement we did that's somewhat related, but a little bit different, and we did this on dried soils. So we let the soils air dry, and then we re-wet them up to the same water holding capacity of about 50 or 60% water holding capacity. And then we incubate them sometimes we do it for a day, sometimes we do it up to 2 weeks. I believe these were 2-week incubations in this study. And that is kind of a measure of the resilience of microbes. So their bodies, after they've been dried down, you wet them back up. If the soil started with high microbial biomass, it's likely to have another high responsive return. But then also all the turnover and the labile carbon that's available to those microbes, or the food that they can eat when they're re-wet and they're hungry and they're eating a lot of this. And that measurement also, and we talked about this a bit in the paper, that measurement also has been tied to nutrient cycling. So there have been a few pretty convincing studies to me that sometimes the measurement's called CO2 burst, especially if it's a shorter measurement. This measurement of microbial respiration after being re-dried is a good indicator of nitrogen supplying power, how much nitrogen can be mineralized from soil organic matter. That was our second measurement, our second canary, Abby. And the last one was permanganate oxidizable carbon, POC. My friend and colleague Steve Coleman jokes it sounds like a disease when we abbreviate it like that. POC, though, is it's used a lot by researchers. I think the NRCS maybe has adopted it as a soil health indicator. There are a lot of researchers that have looked at it, although there's been some contention on exactly what it's measuring. It does, from some previous experiments, and my colleague Steve Coleman that I referred to earlier, he has shown that it's pretty responsive to management practices, which is why we thought that it would be one of the more responsive variables in our canary category. But it turned out that measurement was not responsive to soil health principles, whereas the respiration, the potential mineralizable carbon, and the microbial biomass were much more responsive. We don't know why, but I will say that that POC measurement has we've seen in some individual studies that it's not as responsive as these other two measurements.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Marshall's paper, Putting the Soil Health Principles to the Test in Iowa, published in Soil Science Society of America Journal, is always freely available. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Let's get back to the show. So, we've talked about kind of what your 6 measurements were and why you picked those. We've talked a little bit about some of the results, but I would love to hear any other results you had about how responsive things were or not. And also, I'm curious about when you were giving these ranks to these experiments, is it kind of a collective score of I know you kind of mentioned you have some of the like factorial ones that would rank a little higher, or but is it just if you have this score you can expect maybe these kinds of changes, or was it more tied to specific principles, like if you use more cover you can expect this specific measurement to be more affected? So I would love to hear about kind of the 1-to-1 or 1-to-many relationships that were there, as well as kind of what your other results were.
Sure, yeah, and we didn't really cover this in the kind of setup too. I think explaining the score is really important, and there have been maybe a handful of studies that have done something kind of similar to this, and we by no means have got this exactly right. We'd be the first to admit this, but this was kind of a first stab at it, and we took a what I would call an unbiased or unweighted approach. So each score has a total value of 1, or each soil health principle has a maximum value of 1. So if you were to add up all 5, you can get a maximum score of 5 points based on each of the management practices over the 109 plots that we sampled from several long-term experiments. Some of those are more nuanced than others. I'd say some of our least nuanced ones is the animal integration. And part of that is just because we don't at Iowa State, and I think I could probably speak for a lot of other universities in the Midwest. We just don't have a lot of integrated grazing experiments. There are very few of them. I can count them on one hand. And so we had to kind of come up with animal integration, either 0, which, all synthetic nutrients, or 1, including manure. We didn't even have an integrated actual having animals in the field. Whereas Wisconsin, for example, has a long-term experiment where they do have an integrated cropping system with crops and animals. So that was kind of our most simple one. It was the each plot either got a 0 or a 1 if it had manure-based fertilizer. There were some more kind of a little more nuanced one. We talked about cover crops a little bit, so maximizing living roots, annual crops. So if they, were planted in the spring and harvested in the fall, and there's no roots outside of that window, they got a 0. Cover crops got half a point, 0.5 for that soil health principle. And a perennial plant, like we included 2 cropping systems I can think of off the top of my head. Miscanthus, which is a biomass crop that's perennial, meaning it comes back every year. We can harvest it year after year. We just plant the rhizomes once. And then we have actually a cropped prairie experiment that's quite unusual. The comparison of biofuel systems experiment that's near Ames, and we planted a native prairie mix, but we have both a fertilized and unfertilized one that we harvest the biomass off every year. And so that one, those Miscanthus and the prairie receive 1 for the maximizing living roots because they're perennial plants and they're living all year round, or at least dormant and growing for a larger portion of the year than an annual crop. I won't go into the nitty gritty details on you kind of maximizing the soil cover and disturbance and plant diversity, but we had more complex calculations for number of plants and how long and all of that. That could be found in the paper.
Perfect. And so then you said it was kind of just this unbiased addition kind of situation. So there wasn't anything that was like this specific principle tied to this specific result or anything like that. It was kind of just the score and then the principles or the measurements.
Yeah, it was really like I said, an unweighted or unbiased approach where we look at all principles equally, right? So they all could be a maximum of 1, and how we calculated that was kind of a rough stab at it. I'm curious, though, Hillary's thoughts on, are there principles that you all either talk to growers about or you think about as more important than others? And, I have maybe some opinions or thoughts on that, but it's hard because no one's kind of done this kind of integrated approach before.
Yeah. So talking to different farmers, talking to professionals that have been in this space for a lot longer than I have, I feel like there's multiple camps that believe, this principle has the most impact, and then others think that a different principle has more impact. So that is something that I would really like to see more data or more information on, to try to tease that apart. And that was a question I had for you, actually, Marshall. I don't know how you would begin to sort that out, to try to apply different weights to each principle. I'm not sure how you would set that up for another research project, but definitely a question that I have and other people as well.
Yeah, I've given that some thought, Hillary, and I don't even know if we could set up an experiment to test that, because many of the practices, right, not the principles, cover more than one practice. So it's almost hard to tease them out. Like I'm thinking of something like cover crops. They cover, pun intended, both the maximizing living roots, but also maximizing cover, also plant diversity. That's why it's kind of tough to tease this out, and why this is one of the reasons why we went with kind of an unbiased approach and just calculated it based on, our metrics.
Yeah, a big fan of that. Thank you I just wanted clarity. So I think your answers kind of bring us neatly to kind of my next 2 questions. So you mentioned this is all kind of a new approach, and we've talked a little bit about some of just the complexity that's involved in these kinds of things. So I would love to hear a little bit more about kind of some of the other factors that people might want to consider. We've kind of already covered the need to weight different measurements or desire to, whether or not that's feasible. But I had like uncertain tests written down, and then also moving forward from there, it seems like there are a lot of great implications and takeaways and kind of just practical things that farmers can get from this research. So I would love to hear more about both of those.
Yeah. So, since we're kind of tying up some of the findings, I think, and this is one of the things that excites me about this research and other fields of research. So we were pretty influenced by some work that was going on with conservation in wildlife, like birds and others. And there's some research on this kind of evidence-based, what's called evidence-based conservation. And I think conservation works best when the conservationists and the scientists work together. And that's why I really like working with Hillary. And she makes me feel fun and excited about working and doing conservation. And I hope it's likewise, and she gets excited when we're talking about soil health together. And I think that is kind of the best of all worlds, because we take ideas and get the hypotheses from my colleagues at the NRCS, like in this paper, right? And we want to test it, right? Because the underlying assumption is the more of these soil health principles you adopt, the greater your soil health should be, except nobody is really putting that to the test as we did in our paper. And so we took this kind of integrated, holistic approach across multiple long-term experiments and did that. And I think for me, what makes it so rewarding is, one, working with folks like Hillary on this, but in the realm of science, people put a lot of emphasis on publishing in prestigious journals. And I really like Soil Science Society of America journal where we publish this. But to me, one of the most rewarding things, a colleague of mine from Nebraska, she sent me a photo of some NRCS staff. I think I've told Hillary this story already, but the NRCS staff was holding my paper up at a field day talking to farmers. Now that is worth more than publishing in Science or Nature to me. That I've done my job when there's NRCS folks I don't even know. Hillary I know, so I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking about a paper that she helped inform and I talked to her about. But somebody I didn't even know in Nebraska was talking about this research, so that's really cool. I think the other thing is, like, if I were to continue, and some of the limitations I see of it is, one, we took an unweighted approach. It is what it is. But it would be nice if we expanded to other environments, other climates, other soils, made it more broad than central Iowa. This was something the reviewers of the paper had pointed out, that this is just Iowa. In fact, for full transparency, one of the reviewers asked us we had a shorter title. It was Putting the Soil Health Principles to the Test. And they said, put in Iowa at the end of it. So fair enough. It is in Iowa. And so it'd be neat to see this done in other regions where they kind of test the soil health principles and see if they get the same results or different ones. The other thing I would say that we really missed the mark on, I wish we had more experiments like this, is grazing, integrated grazing experiments. Those should be really ticking a lot of the boxes for soil health principles. And we just didn't have any in our survey, in our study.
Yeah, so I'll chime in with what I hear and see across the state working with farmers. When they're new to this, they're changing their management practices, they're reducing tillage, they're maybe incorporating animals, they're adding cover crops. They want to know how quickly they can see those impacts. Anecdotally, I've heard from multiple people across the state that the first thing they see is that the water, when they get rain, will infiltrate more quickly. But a lot of farmers are, they adopt these practices. Maybe they get some cost share to start these practices, And so they do it for a period of years, and then at the end, they're not sure if it has made a difference. They see the additional money that they've spent on cover crop seed and uh, the incorporation of that, but then they're not sure if it's making an impact on their ground. And so that's where myself as a soil health specialist, we have a team of specialists across the state. We love working with farmers and field office staff to go out there and dig and see if they can see changes in their structure. We can do infiltration tests to see if the water is soaking in quicker. But we're still, these soil health tests, I think, are the new kid on the block, especially in terms of some of these standard fertility soil tests that we have out there. We're still, and maybe there isn't one size fits all test that if I have a farmer that calls and says, hey, I've been doing this for a while, I want to know if I'm moving the needle, still looking for that magic test that can provide them that information. So Marshall's research has given me more confidence in the soil health principles that they are helping move the needle for these farmers. And it just, I guess, shines a light on the importance of getting out there, looking at your soil, especially if you're thinking about incorporating these practices, even if you're not, for those of you listening, if you don't have a farm, if you're thinking about trying this in a garden or a situation like that, get out there and dig and look at your soil before you start these practices. Take pictures, write notes. The NRCS has an assessment tool where we go through different indicators looking at the soil structure, what are the roots doing. So getting preliminary information and then incorporating those practices, giving it a few years, and then going back out there to dig to see if you can see the changes. I think that really gives people the confidence to keep moving forward if they can see that they're making a difference.
Sure, totally. Yeah. Reminds me of like people that start a fitness journey and they like take pictures beforehand and then they
Yes.
soil health.
100%. Well, and when I'm presenting, I talk about that in terms of soil health is very similar to human health, and so you didn't gain weight overnight. So if you incorporate your healthy, I'm drinking less beer, I'm eating less donuts. I want to lose this weight super fast. The soil's the same way. It takes a while for those changes to show up, but you are making a difference. You're making positive change, but it just takes time. And we talked about inherent properties. That also plays a big role. The more degraded your soil, it may take longer to see those impacts, and it just depends on your situation, I guess. So, yeah. So I just find this information fascinating.
Yeah, me too. This has been a great conversation so far. So we've talked a little bit about some of the areas for future research, but I did just want to bring up the question if there are any other areas that you would like to explore moving forward that we haven't discussed already.
Yeah, I think we covered a few of these. I think expanding this to other areas or even a broader area to see if we still find the same positive relationships with the soil health principles is really key, because many of them are universal. They're being recommended in Canada, in Mexico, in the Northeast. It would be neat to see if others find the same thing, or if we can expand the data set and have a common measurement that we could rank against this soil health principle score as well. I mentioned the importance of including more animal livestock grazing rather than just kind of manure as an indirect way of integrating animals like we had in two of our long-term experiments. Yeah, maybe even expanding to some other soil health indicators or measurements. I mean, as I kind of alluded to, I'm a big fan of measuring this microbial biomass over my 20 plus years of doing research in soil science. I found it to be one of the most responsive. It's um, rather easy, but a lot of labs, I think maybe because of the chloroform and other reasons, they don't adopt it, but it's pretty rapid compared to some other tests, and is just linked to a lot of other important aspects of soil health or ecosystem services. Like we know microbes are important for long-term soil accrual, organic carbon accrual. They're important for nutrient cycling. They themselves are kind of an indicator of the soil as a habitat, right? If you make the house and improve the house, those physical structural attributes that Hillary was talking about, you should increase microbial biomass, right? All of those things are important reasons why some measure of microbial abundance or biomass or activity has to be on the soil health docket. And the last thing, at least I'll say for now, is that one of the things we wrote in the paper to get back to the animal metaphors or animal analogies is that soil microbial biomass, which is just measured as the living mass, the carbon that's in microbes in the soil from 0 to 6 inches. We measured that using the chloroform fumigation method, and we found that for each soil health principle adopted, you get 30 to 50 milligrams of carbon per kilogram of dry soil. So that's a concentration of the carbon that's in the microbe biomass. But if you scale that out to a hectare, which is about 2.5 acres, for each soil health principle adopted, you get about one bison or one African elephant per hectare per soil health principle adopted. So that's all the below ground livestock that are helping cycle nutrients, sequester carbon, and doing a whole bunch of other important things in soils.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
incredible. I was like, he's gonna say like a mouse, and then it was a significantly larger animal. Because
I should have clarified that's per acre. So
yeah.
a elephant per acre.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think I was thinking a smaller piece of land. So, but still, I mean, that's incredible. That's awesome. Um, Hillary, did you have any future research that you wanted to add?
Probably echoing what Marshall said. Like I said, the questions that I get from farmers, they're interested to see how quickly they can move that needle, and then what specific tests they might consider to do so. And like Marshall said, the accessibility of those tests makes a difference. We often rely on aggregate stability. We can do a simple slake test or a slump test in the field with them, but anything to reinforce some of these tests. There's just a lot of unknowns. I think, like I said, it's a relatively new science, and so um, I found it interesting that the POC didn't respond um, in this paper, and so trying to learn more about why that occurred, because as Marshall mentioned, that is one of our tests. NRCS does offer some cost share for farmers that if they want to do some soil health tests, they can do so, and that's one of the options. So just trying to sort through all of that, and then there's farmers that get a little discouraged when they're making all of the changes or incorporating these management practices, and the numbers don't correspond. But like Marshall said, these are biological systems, and so there's a lot of fluctuation even within a field. And so just trying to help walk the farmer through that. This may or may not be why you saw those differences, and trying to keep them, I guess, committed to, your practices are making a difference and they're improving your soil function. So, I just have lots of questions, and I'm a nerd, and I love learning all this stuff. So it's been fun to work with Marshall.
Wonderful. Yeah, we love curious nerds here. You are certainly welcome. So I have 3 questions left for you. The first one is, if anybody would like to learn more about any of the things that we've talked about today, where can they go?
So the NRCS Soil Health website has links to a lot of our information. We do have something called an in-field soil health assessment, and that's what I referred to earlier. That's got 11 different indicators looking at your infiltration, your aggregate stability, looking at roots, to help you walk through to assess the health of your soil. And so that's probably, I love that tool, just, for a conversation piece when I'm meeting with farmers. It can be really eye-opening. So that's where I would start with NRCS information.
Yeah, and I would say any details about the paper, of course, check out the paper. I think you're going to put a link in the podcast. And we've got a couple other publications that are related, like some of the methods on especially the DIY test that I'll leave as well. And then if anyone's interested in the research that the great folks in the lab do, you can find us on soil-plant.com. If you just Google McDaniel Lab, you'll be able to find it. And then we're also on X and Blue Sky, and you can find out the other research we do.
Perfect. We will include links to as many of those as we get our hands on. Second question, other than the self-assessment, if people would like to take the next step to kind of get involved with any of the things that we talked about today, what can they do?
So as far as NRCS, information or cost share programs, I would encourage folks to reach out to their local field office. You can find that information by Googling USDA Service Center, and then you can select your state and your county, and it will give you the contact information for your local field office staff.
I really liked Hillary's suggestion about, just getting out and making observations, even and writing things down and kind of journaling almost, and being a scientist of your garden or your field. I would encourage everybody to do that. And then we will post, again, the links to some easy DIY soil health measurements that you could do with either a mobile phone app or simple things in your kitchen or garage that you might already have.
Perfect. Yeah, that is great advice for people looking to get involved in soil health. So, final question then is, what is one fun fact about each of you that people wouldn't know if all they had was your research?
Okay. Well, I am a amateur drummer. I'm trying to learn how to play drums. Unfortunately for my neighbors.
That's awesome.
So, we'll see. Maybe it'll get better. I've been in bands before, but it's usually playing guitar. I haven't played guitar in a while because my little spare time, I will try practicing drums. So, if anybody's looking for a band out there, we can start a soil science band.
Perfect. My fun fact is, over the weekend, we went to Puerto Rico with some friends to celebrate a friend's 50th birthday. But we ended up adopting a little puppy over there and brought it home. So very last minute, we were not planning on doing that, but we got in contact with the equivalent of ARL over there, and there's a lot of stray dogs, and so we found a puppy, met them at the airport, bought him a ticket, and away we went. So my kids were very excited when we woke them up Tuesday morning with a new puppy. So
amazing. What's the
name?
name?
Named him Rico.
Rico.
Oh,
Fitting.
nice. That's perfect.
Fitting.
Great.
Oh, I love that. Well, good on you for finding that little pup a home. That's wonderful. And thank you both for all of the work that you're doing. Both testing these things and getting the word out about them, collaborating across multiple experiments, multiple just areas of like the government and also academia and all those fun things. So thank you for being on the show, for all you do.
Thanks. It's been great. It's been a lot of fun.
Yes, thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.